Beneath the golden domes of Topkapi Palace, where sultans ruled an empire spanning 3 continents, lay secrets darker than the deepest dungeons. The Ottoman Empire, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia, dazzled the world with its architectural marvels and military might. Yet behind the intricate, latticed windows and ornate chambers, a different kind of power structure existed, one built on human bondage and silent suffering. The year is 1650. Constantinople bustles with merchants, scholars, and diplomats. But venture deeper into the palace's forbidden quarters and you'll discover a world where hundreds of women lived as prisoners dressed in silk. This was the imperial harem, often romanticized by European observers as an exotic paradise of luxury and leisure. The reality was far more sinister. These weren't willing residents living lives of comfort. They were enslaved women, some barely teenagers torn from their families across Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Africa. Each had been reduced to a commodity, their worth measured not by their dreams or talents, but by their beauty and their ability to bear the Sultan's children. Their stories have been buried beneath centuries of imperial propaganda and Orientalist fantasy. The Ottoman court chroniclers wrote of military victories and architectural achievements, but they remained deliberately silent about the systematic enslavement that fueled the empire's domestic life. European ambassadors glimpsed the harem's exterior splendor but never witnessed the desperation within its walls. The women themselves left no written records. Literacy was often forbidden, and speaking of their experiences meant death. Tonight, we pierce through these veils of secrecy to uncover what really happened behind the silk curtains. This isn't a tale of exotic romance or willing concubines living in paradise. This is the story of how an empire's grandest palace became a gilded prison, where young women's lives were destroyed in service to imperial power. Their voices may have been silenced, but their truth demands to be heard. What you're about to discover will forever change how you see one of history's most celebrated empires and reveal the human cost of absolute power. Every Tuesday and Friday, the great bazaars of Constantinople transformed into theaters of human misery. In the shadows of the Grand Bazaar, where spices and silks changed hands, a different kind of merchandise awaited buyers. The slave markets of the Ottoman capital operated with the cold efficiency of any other commercial enterprise, but their products were human beings, primarily young women destined for lives of servitude. The process began long before these women reached Constantinople's auction blocks. Crimean Tatar raiders swept through Ukrainian and Polish villages in the dead of night, snatching girls from their beds. Circassian families in the Caucasus, devastated by poverty and warfare, sometimes sold their own daughters to slave traders, believing it offered a chance at survival. Along the African coast, Portuguese and Ottoman merchants purchased women already enslaved by local conflicts, shipping them northward like cargo. Upon arrival in Constantinople, these women faced their first devastating ritual, the medical examination. Stripped naked in cold stone chambers, they were inspected by physicians and potential buyers alike. Their teeth were checked like horses, their bodies scrutinized for signs of disease or pregnancy. Virginity commanded premium prices, while any physical defect could render a woman nearly worthless in the market's brutal calculus. The slave merchants operated with sophisticated business acumen. They categorized women by origin. Circassian girls were prized for their pale skin and blonde hair, while Ethiopian women were sought for their exotic beauty. Age mattered enormously. Girls between 12 and 16 fetched the highest prices as they were considered most suitable for training and least likely to resist their new circumstances. Buyers ranged from wealthy Ottoman officials seeking household servants to specialized agents purchasing women specifically for the imperial harem. The palace buyers were the most discerning, selecting only the most beautiful candidates who showed signs of intelligence and adaptability. These women would command prices equivalent to several houses, but their elevated status meant entering an even more controlled and dangerous environment. The transaction itself was conducted with chilling formality. Bills of sale were meticulously recorded, establishing legal ownership as clearly as any property deed. The women were branded or tattooed to prevent escape and establish ownership. Names, often the only connection to their former lives, were immediately changed to Turkish equivalents, completing their transformation from human beings to possessions. The psychological impact was calculated and devastating. Language barriers isolated the women from each other and their captors. Religious conversion was mandatory. Those who refused faced starvation or beatings until they complied. Within weeks, young women who had once helped their mothers tend gardens or care for siblings found themselves property of men who viewed them as investments. What made the system particularly insidious was its integration into Ottoman society's fabric. Wealthy families considered owning female slaves a mark of status. Religious authorities sanctioned the practice through carefully interpreted Islamic law. The state profited through taxes on slave sales while simultaneously depending on enslaved women to populate the imperial household. As these transactions concluded and the women were led away in chains, they crossed an invisible threshold from which few would ever return. The markets had completed their function, transforming human beings into commodities ready for consumption by an empire that had perfected the art of institutional dehumanization. Behind the mother-of-pearl inlaid doors of Topkapi Palace's harem lay what European visitors described as an earthly paradise, a realm of fountain courtyards, silk divans, and jeweled chambers where hundreds of women lived in apparent luxury. The reality was a meticulously designed prison that used comfort as camouflage for complete control. The harem's architecture itself told the story of captivity. No windows faced the outside world, only interior courtyards provided light. Guards were exclusively eunuchs, men castrated to ensure the sultan's exclusive access to his women. Every entrance was monitored, every movement tracked. The golden cage was beautiful, but it remained a cage nonetheless. Within this enclosed world existed a rigid hierarchy more complex than the empire's military structure. At the apex sat the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, wielding absolute authority over all other women. She had survived the system's brutalities and now perpetuated them, understanding that her own security depended on maintaining order through fear and favoritism. Below her were the Kadhan Effendi, women who had borne the Sultan's children and achieved relative safety through motherhood. These women commanded their own households within the harem, served by lower-ranking slaves, and constantly maneuvering to advance their sons' positions in the imperial succession. Their elevated status came at the cost of complete loyalty to a system that had enslaved them. The Gedikli occupied the middle ranks, women skilled in music, embroidery, or other arts who served the higher-ranking inhabitants. They lived in constant hope of catching the Sultan's attention, knowing that a single night in his bed could transform their circumstances forever. This possibility kept them compliant, even as years passed without such elevation. At the bottom were the Assemi newly arrived slaves undergoing training in palace etiquette, Islamic practices, and Turkish language. They endured the harshest conditions, sleeping on hard floors, eating scraps, and facing daily beatings for minor infractions. The lesson was clear. Total submission was the only path to survival. Competition among the women was deliberately fostered. The system pitted mothers against childless women, recent arrivals against established residents, and ethnic groups against each other. Circassian women were told they were naturally superior to African slaves, while Slavic women were reminded of their inferior origins. These divisions prevented unified resistance and ensured that anger was directed horizontally rather than upward toward their captors. The daily routine was suffocating in its regimentation. Prayers occurred at prescribed times, meals were communal and monitored, and activities were assigned rather than chosen. Education existed solely to make the women more valuable to their master. Basic literacy was sometimes permitted, but only for palace administration purposes. Any signs of independent thinking were quickly suppressed. Perhaps most insidiously, the harem created its own internal logic of success. Women learned to measure their worth by their proximity to power rather than their fundamental human dignity. Rising in the hierarchy meant accepting and enforcing the system that had destroyed their former lives. The few who achieved positions of influence became the most zealous defenders of practices that had once terrorized them. Romance played no role in these relationships. The Sultan's visits were political acts designed to produce heirs and demonstrate dominance. Women understood they were performing services, not engaging in love affairs. Those who failed to please faced immediate banishment to distant provinces or death. The myth of the harem as paradise served the empire's propaganda needs perfectly. It suggested that enslaved women were willing participants in their own captivity, living lives of luxury that peasant women could only dream of experiencing. This narrative obscured the fundamental truth that no amount of silk and jewelry could compensate for the loss of freedom, family, and human dignity that defined every woman's existence within those ornate walls. Within the harem's suffocating confines, survival demanded the complete abandonment of personal identity and the adoption of an entirely new existence built around one man's desires. The women learned quickly that their previous lives, their names, their families, their beliefs, their dreams, were luxuries they could no longer afford. Everything now revolved around pleasing the Sultan and navigating the treacherous waters of palace politics where a single misstep could mean death. The training process was designed to break down psychological resistance systematically. New arrivals underwent months of intensive conditioning, supervised by older slaves who had internalized the system's rules. They learned to walk with their eyes downcast, to speak only when spoken to, and to anticipate their master's needs before he expressed them. The Turkish language was beaten into them along with Islamic prayers, replacing their mother tongues with the vocabulary of submission. Sexual availability was absolute and non-negotiable. The Sultan's physical desires took precedence over everything else. Illness, exhaustion, or personal trauma provided no excuse for refusal. Women learned to smile while enduring acts they found repugnant, to express gratitude for attention they desperately wished to avoid. Those who showed reluctance or distaste faced immediate punishment, while those who feigned enthusiasm received slightly better treatment. The competition for imperial favor created a psychological battleground more vicious than any military campaign. Women sabotaged each other's chances through gossip, poison, and strategic manipulation. Friendships were dangerous luxuries that could be weaponized by rivals or interpreted as conspiracies by suspicious overseers. Trust became impossible when survival depended on outmaneuvering every other woman in the harem. Pregnancy offered the only potential escape from this existence, but it came with its own terrors. Carrying the Sultan's child elevated a woman's status dramatically, but it also made her a target for other wives who saw each new heir as a threat to their own children's prospects. Miscarriages were sometimes celebrated by rivals, while successful births triggered elaborate schemes to eliminate both mother and child. The palace's reward system was calculated to maintain hope while ensuring dependency. Women who excelled in their duties might receive better quarters, finer clothes, or the privilege of serving higher-ranking inhabitants. These small improvements felt enormous within the context of their restricted lives, creating gratitude for minor alleviations of misery rather than anger at their fundamental condition. Religious conversion was enforced through a combination of incentives and punishments that made resistance nearly impossible. Those who clung to their original faiths faced starvation, solitary confinement, and physical abuse until they submitted. The palace imams who supervised these conversions understood that broken spirits accepted new beliefs more readily than intact ones. Intelligence became a double-edged sword in this environment. Clever women could navigate the system more successfully, gaining positions of influence and relative security. However, too much intelligence was dangerous. Women who showed signs of independent thinking or leadership ability were eliminated before they could inspire others. The ideal slave was smart enough to be useful, but not wise enough to recognize the full scope of her oppression. The psychological toll was devastating and permanent. Women developed elaborate coping mechanisms. Some retreated into fantasy worlds where they imagined themselves elsewhere. Others embraced their captivity so completely that they lost touch with their original identities. Many experienced what we would now recognize as severe depression and trauma responses, but the palace physicians treated only physical ailments. Communication with the outside world was completely severed. Letters were forbidden, visitors were impossible, and even knowledge of events beyond the palace walls was carefully controlled. The women existed in an information vacuum designed to make their former lives feel like distant dreams rather than achievable realities. Perhaps most tragically, the system created generational trauma that extended beyond the harem's walls. Sons born to enslaved mothers grew up understanding that women were property to be owned and used. Daughters learned from birth that their value lay solely in their ability to please men. The cycle of dehumanization thus perpetuated itself across centuries of Ottoman rule. Survival in this environment required the complete suppression of natural human instincts toward freedom, dignity, and self-determination. The women who lived longest were those who successfully transformed themselves into what their captors wanted them to be. beautiful, compliant, and grateful objects whose entire existence revolved around serving masculine power. This transformation was presented as success, but it represented the ultimate victory of institutional brutality over human spirit. For those who dared to resist the harem's suffocating control, the Ottoman Empire had perfected methods of punishment that served as brutal examples to others. The palace executioners, known as the bostanci, carried out sentences with calculated precision designed to maximize both physical agony and psychological terror among the remaining women. The most common form of execution was strangulation with silk bowstrings, a method considered merciful by Ottoman standards but experienced as prolonged torture by its victims. Women condemned to death were taken to isolated chambers where they faced their executioners alone, with no witnesses except palace officials who recorded their final moments for administrative purposes. The silk cords were chosen deliberately. Even in death, the empire maintained its aesthetic pretensions while destroying lives. For those whose offenses were deemed particularly serious, attempting escape, refusing sexual compliance, or showing defiance toward their superiors drowning in the Bosphorus became the preferred method. The victims were sewn into weighted silk sacks and transported by boat to deep waters under cover of darkness. This practice served multiple purposes. It eliminated evidence of the execution, prevented any possibility of rescue, and created an atmosphere of mystery that enhanced the fear among surviving women. The psychological torture often proved more devastating than physical punishment. Women who showed signs of rebellion were subjected to sensory deprivation, locked in windowless cells without human contact for weeks or months. Others faced the systematic destruction of any remaining connections to their former lives. Personal possessions were burned before their eyes, news of family members' deaths was delivered with cruel satisfaction, and any symbols of their original identities were obliterated. Public humiliation within the harem served as a constant reminder of the price of disobedience. Women who violated rules were forced to perform degrading acts in front of other slaves, crawling on hands and knees, eating from the floor like animals, or enduring beatings while their peers watched in terrified silence. These spectacles reinforced the message that dignity was a privilege that could be revoked at any moment. The empire's record-keeping regarding these punishments was deliberately sparse. Palace chroniclers documented military victories and architectural achievements in elaborate detail, but executions and tortures were recorded only in coded administrative notes. This systematic erasure served to minimize evidence of atrocities while ensuring that knowledge of punishment spread through whispered warnings among the women themselves. Perhaps most chillingly, the system recruited its own victims as enforcers. Women who had survived years in the harem and achieved positions of authority became the most zealous punishers of newer arrivals. They understood that their own security depended on maintaining order through fear, creating a cycle where the oppressed became oppressors to preserve their precarious safety. The silence surrounding these practices was enforced through terror and complicity. European diplomats who might have reported such abuses were deliberately kept ignorant, while Ottoman officials who witnessed executions were bound by oaths of secrecy that carried death sentences if broken. The result was a systematic campaign of violence that left no official trace while destroying countless lives behind the palace's beautiful facades. Today, tourists wander through Topkapi Palace's restored chambers, admiring the intricate tilework and panoramic views of the Bosphorus. They pose for photographs in the harem's courtyards, now sanitized and silent, where plaques describe the exotic lifestyle of Ottoman royal women. But the voices of the enslaved remain absent from these official narratives. The Ottoman Empire's legacy extends far beyond its architectural achievements and military conquests. For over 6 centuries, this system of institutionalized slavery shaped not only the lives of countless women, but also established patterns of gender oppression that echoed through generations. The descendants of these enslaved women, scattered across former Ottoman territories, carry genetic and cultural memories of trauma that official histories refuse to acknowledge. Modern Turkey, the Ottoman Empire's successor state, has largely erased this dark chapter from its national memory. School textbooks celebrate imperial grandeur while omitting the systematic brutalization that sustained it. The romanticized image of the harem, popularized by European Orientalist paintings and Hollywood films, continues to obscure the reality of what occurred behind those palace walls. The women who suffered and died in service to imperial power left no memoirs, no letters, no monuments to their memory. Their names were erased, their cultures destroyed, their children raised to forget their mother's origins. Yet their experience illuminates a fundamental truth about absolute power. It corrupts not only those who wield it, but entire societies that permit its exercise without moral constraint. The glittering empire was built on conquest, yes, but also on the silent screams of women, whose stories we are only now beginning to understand.